Well, Iain, it's great to be here with you on Sky. And I suppose how I found my way here is that for years people have been telling me you must read The Master and His Emissary.
Right.
Many people around Dark Mountain have been strongly influenced by it as a book. And last autumn, when I had just finished work on At Work in the Ruins, I finally sat down with it and understood why. Because the question that I'm starting from in At Work in the Ruins is, what's the nature of the trouble that the world is in? Not least the part of that trouble that rides under the name of climate change. Mm. And early in the book, I say, whenever we get into a conversation about climate change, that conversation starts inevitably inside the frame of science, because it's science that brings us the news and gives us ways of talking about it. Climate change is a scientific concept. And yet, I've been going around for years saying, climate change asks us questions that science cannot answer. And the example of that I centre on in the book is, how did we find ourselves in this trouble? Is it the result of a piece of bad luck with the atmospheric chemistry? That it turns out 7 generations down the line that building industrial societies around all of these fossil fuels is throwing out of whack the climate system on which the conditions of possibility of human societies as we've known them have taken place? So is it bad luck? Or is it a consequence of a way of approaching the world, a way of seeing and treating everyone and everything that would anyway have brought us to such a pass, even if the atmospheric chemistry had been different, had been less sensitive to all these carbon dioxide emissions? And I feel like you've given one of the fullest accounts I've come across of that way of approaching the world.
Yes. Well, thank you. I suppose when one talks about how we got here, there are a number of different ways you can answer that question. So it's not wrong, of course, to say that it's a problem to do with our use of fossil fuels and so on, but that itself is rooted in something bigger and beyond, I believe, which is, as you say, a whole conception of what we are, what the planet is, and how the two relate.
So how do we begin to describe that or unpack that in a way that might help us ground the conversations that go on about climate change differently to the way they often seem to?
Yes. The difficulty is that there isn't a very easy way to say, well, if only you say this or do that, it will work. It's more a kind of way of being in the world that we need, which we've lost. But it can, I think, encouragingly be recovered, and is, I see, and I'm sure you see this, of course, that there is a hunger for a way of thinking about ourselves and what we're doing here that is more sophisticated and more inclusive than the one that we've been taught. We've been sort of, almost without realizing it, we've been dragooned into a way of thinking that would have seemed extremely odd to our ancestors and to most people who are not brought up in the modern Western tradition. And it's a very modern thing even in the West. I mean, I would say perhaps only the last 200 years at the maximum that we have adopted this very harshly reductionist, strictly materialist way of thinking. And I think that is at the bottom of what we've got wrong.
And you used that word modern several times there. One of the books that was kind of in the field of possibility, or created the field of possibility for what I've been writing, is a book called Hospicing Modernity by Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, who's a Brazilian scholar who's based in Canada. And that image of what is called for in the kind of times we're in, being neither to try and save modernity and make it somehow sustainable, nor to try and overthrow it and bring it down or stage some kind of revolution, but being to give it a good ending, not least so that it can pass on the lessons that it has for us that may only be revealed in its ending. And it feels like that is part of what the the hunger or the longing that that you're describing, that I think we both encounter.
I like that idea very much, because, as you say, a sort of overthrow, it's always a bad idea to do something peremptory and abrupt, but we haven't got a lot of time, and we may not be able to, as it were, save modernity. But as you say, it's very important that whatever we leave is something that is viable and useful to whatever comes after us.
After Paul and I wrote the Dark Mountain Manifesto, I found myself increasingly getting invited into rooms where climate scientists were being brought together with artists and indigenous elders and people representing different kinds of knowledge or practice. And it felt like the invitation from the scientists, on the one hand, there was an assumption that we were going to somehow have a magic way to help deliver the message, get people to listen to what the science was telling. So we were being sort of enlisted.
Yes, I see.
As a message delivery system. And I used to say this, I don't think this is quite what we're for.
No.
But equally, where that was coming from, there was a sense of helplessness on the part of the scientists of, we have the knowledge, we can tell people, and the kind of knowledge we produce is what the modern world says is the only kind of knowledge that is reality. And yet when we come with a message that calls into question our ability to just continue and extend these trajectories of growth and progress and development as they have been understood around here recently, suddenly they're not listening to us any more than they would listen to the protesters who are outside the gates of the COP meeting. And what I've experienced as a paradox is I find myself trying to say science has to take a humbler role in relation to the other kinds of knowledge and practice that are showing up here, to people who are experiencing a sense of helplessness as scientists or as people bringing the message from science, where to say that more humility might be what's called for, which I think was also in the language that you were using just now. At first glance, that sounds like the last thing that is needed, and yet there's a deep truth in there, and actually a sense of relief often when we get properly into dialogue with scientists and non-scientists around this, at science not being asked to carry all the weight of knowing the world and telling us what needs to be done.
Absolutely, and the false impression that science can do far more than science can ever be asked to achieve is one of the reasons for people feeling that science is an enemy, whereas I believe it to be a hugely valuable tool. But it is only that. And if one can see it as that, and rather overreaching claims are not made for it, then that rift can be reconciled. People can see it for what it is. It's when it pretends to be a sort of omnipotent and omniscient, or potentially so. We're nearly there, only a few more experiments and we really understand it all. That is the sort of thing that makes any experienced and wise person feel alienated from the discourse. So I think what we want is to rehabilitate science. I find myself in the odd position that I'm a great believer in both science and reason, and have spent most of my life trying to practice these things. And it falls to somebody who believes in them passionately to point out their limitations. So another thing that I do is to say reason is hugely valuable, but first of all it depends what you mean by reason, as it depends what you mean by science. And secondly, it depends on what you're asking it to do. It can do certain things, but beyond that it can't go. So there are certain things that we know are very real, but are somehow beyond the reach of mere reason. The nature of music would be an example. We can rationalize about its structure, we can analyze it, we can take it apart, and we can get notes, and we can look at them in our electron microscope, and we can say this note is nothing, but the music is something very great. So it's that process that needs to be done. And so what I'm really saying is the over-defensiveness of science and the over-defensiveness of reason are understandable, because at the moment they're under attack, I think very wrongly. But the reason they may be under attack is because they are misrepresenting themselves, or maybe not even that, but there has gone into the popular culture a myth that science can do everything, that reason can answer all our questions. But there's absolutely no question that these claims are unsubstantiated and unsubstantiable.
And the analogy that I use is to say, how does one be a friend to science?
Yes.
If your friend is tripping on acid on the roof of a building and thinks he can fly, to be a friend to them is not to go, yeah, man, go for it.
Absolutely.
It's to put your arm around the shoulder and say, why don't we sit down over here and have a little chat?
Yes.
Which I feel is kind of what you have been doing in a way that takes it away also from the conflictual mode of engagement with the limits of science that doesn't...
That's a very good, vivid example. I like it. And it's effectively the ancient saying, Plato is my friend, but a greater friend is truth. And, so attributed to Aristotle, probably wrongly. But it's that if you are a friend of science and of reason, you don't misrepresent it as something that it isn't, because that way you cause a false falling away from it from people who quite rightly won't accept the extreme positions, the very black and white positions that reason wrongly understood and science wrongly understood can adopt, a sort of dogmatic position. And dogma is our enemy in whatever form it comes. And in our world now there are far too many dogmas and far too many things that can't be questioned, and when you get to that point, as Hannah Arendt said, if things can't be questioned, you're in a tyranny.
So one of the things that I get to in thinking about this is the relationship between what in my terms is knowledge and knowing. And obviously, we talked about this last night. Science as a name for this set of activities only came in around the 1830s.
Exactly.
Prior to that, the people who were doing what we think of as science would have called themselves natural philosophers. And in a sense, that shift of name is reflective of a moment in which a monopoly is being granted, where this set of activities are being seen and seeing themselves as the monopoly on knowing, on the work of knowledge, because that's what science means. What I found myself thinking about is the place where maybe these scientists who I was meeting in these rooms talking about climate change were stuck, is holding the knowledge, where knowledge is the kind of the fruits of these activities, but it's an arm's length thing. And then there's another piece of work which is bringing the knowledge home. Mm-hmm. And if you think about the way in which the language of knowing, I mean, if we go to the Hebrew Bible, for example, the word to know can range from sexual intercourse to intellectual apprehension, or the fruit of the tree of knowledge in Genesis. There's a kind of dance for me between the experience of knowing, out of which I distill knowledge that can be shared, which includes the kinds that can be put in books and on shelves. And then that dance is completed at the moment where a reader brings their own experience to the words so as to bring them back to life in their experience of knowing, which will not mirror perfectly the experience of knowing that led me to write it. But it's a bit like two choreographers who use the same set of choreographic notation. The dance that the second choreographer will make from the notations of the first will be recognizably akin to the first one. And so there's this kind of three-way move of the experience of knowing, the production of knowledge, and then the experience of knowing arising from encountering that. Yes. Which, when I then read The Master and His Emissary, it felt to me very close to the dance of the hemispheres that you're describing, which was striking because what I had been saying was, I think we've got a hierarchy where knowledge is held to be the important bit rather than the experience of knowing, that might be part of where we're getting stuck, part of the trouble we're in.
Absolutely, that's a very rich vein to mine. And as you know, I sometimes contrast, and I don't think it's exactly the same, but the difference is that we have in German and French for different kinds of knowledge. So there's Kennen in German and connaître in French, which means knowing from experience. And there's Wissen in German and savoir in French, which is to know, as it were, the facts. And another way of talking is that there is data, there is information, there is knowledge, and there is understanding. And understanding is intelligence. And it's what, in fact, whatever you do with AI, but that's another story, you won't achieve that understanding, because to have that understanding, you have to have lived an embodied life with emotions and a body and all the what we think of as disadvantages that go with that. So yes, the other thing is that what you describe is what has been amusingly dubbed the McGilchrist manoeuvre, which is my theme, that in all understanding there is a three-step process. The first take on anything, as it were, preconceptually and as a whole, is taken by the right hemisphere. Then at a subsequent stage it is broken down, categorized, analyzed. It's the bare bones of its structure are examined. But then all that knowledge needs to be taken back into the holistic picture of the right hemisphere and absorbed there and become, in a way, implicit in that picture. The easiest example I can give is that of learning a piece of music, where you're first attracted to it as a whole. As you start to play it, you realize you have to practice certain passages, and you start thinking intellectually about the harmonic structure. But when you go on stage to perform, you must forget all that. Not that it was wasted time, it was very important time, but that now it must be taken up into and become implicit in the whole. So I think I hope that's something to do with what you were talking about, with knowledge, the distinction of knowledge and knowing. I mean, perhaps interestingly, knowledge is a noun, knowing is a verbal participle, and what you're talking about is the idea of something which is a lived experience.
Yes, exactly. And one of the things that worries me about the ways in which we are responding to things like climate change, and actually I wonder if this thought might be extended even to the way in which we responded to the pandemic, is this sense of seeing the world through, in your terms, the left brain perspective, so that the world comes to be conceived of as a problem to be solved. That if we can if we can generate enough knowledge about how the world works, then we can come up with the set of solutions for managing the world, as if the world is a thing that needs to be turned into knowledge for its own good in order for it to continue to have a chance of existing. And I think that people can build very kind of convincing arguments for what needs to be done that could actually lead us to very dystopian places.
Indeed, and are doing.
Yeah. Well, and the analogy which I get from my friend Paul Kingsnorth, he talks about all the things that he's learnt from keeping a fish tank with a few freshwater fish in it with his son, and how this, you have to measure the temperature, it can't get too hot, can't get too cold, you have a whole chemistry set of different things that you have to drop into it to regulate it, and all of this to do what a river or a lake does easily and for free. And my concern is that this left brain approach to the world, when it is granted the kind of dominance that it has had in modernity, can't see the difference between a fish tank and a living world. Comes to represent the living world as if it were a fish tank, and then attempts to turn the world into a fish tank, a thing that requires a total system of human management and control.
Yes, again, there's a lot in that, I think. One being the difference in scale, which shouldn't make a difference, but it does, because what we're dealing with in nature and what we're dealing with in human society and dealing with everything important in this world are complex systems, not complicated systems. the distinction being one which is effectively just like a large mechanical system. The complicated system just takes few more arrows and a few more algorithms. But the complex system is one that cannot intrinsically be modelled in this way. It has re-entrant loops, it has uncertainty involved in it. And so there is a grave danger that complex situations are resolved into a complicated structure. There was a hilarious piece of analysis carried out for the US Army in Afghanistan by a London consultancy firm, who generated a map of all that was going on in Afghanistan. And it's hilarious. It's a huge map like this, and it's got little centres everywhere and arrows going in every possible direction. And when this was presented to General McChrystal, a man of experience and a man of action, he responded, "When we understand that, we will have won the war," which you can understand in one of two possible ways. But what intrigues me actually is that at the moment I've just been approached in the last couple of months quite independently by military intelligence pooled between the UK, the US and France, and another approach from military intelligence in Australia to help them untangle why their sort of systematic, abstract ways of working things out are not actually helpful. And that we need to reincorporate into this something which is less certain, less tied down, and if you make a structure too rigid and tighten up all the bolts, it's got no movement, it will crash down. So it needs to have this human intelligence in it. Another way of putting it is that it needs to be anti-fragile in Taleb's terms, but we need to reintroduce the much stigmatized concept of human judgment and intuition.
I love that story of the map in Afghanistan. It makes me think of Borges and the one-to-one map.
Oh yes, that is the size of the whole world. Yes,
because sometimes it seems as if that's the sort of the unintentional foolishness of this attempt to turn the world into a thing that needs to be known in order to exist. And the other example that was coming to mind as you were speaking about it was Dean Bavington, who's an environmental historian in Canada, who comes from Newfoundland and has written about the Newfoundland cod fishery. And the story that he tells is of how the Newfoundland cod fishery collapsed not once but twice. And after the first collapse, it became the pioneering sort of case study of fisheries management, where they were convinced that they now had mapped and knew this wild fishery well enough to say when the boats could go back out again, how much fish they could take. And through the 80s, it was the world's leading sustainable fishery. And then in 92, it collapsed again. And what he describes in fisheries science is this kind of retreat then from attempting to know the wild, living, complex world to saying this is beyond our capacity. And so what we're going to do instead is move to fish farming, where we create deliberately simplified ecosystems that we can know and manage in this way that we failed to do with the wild fishery. And of course, that is also failing because those systems are never really cut off from the wild world. Exactly. They have inputs and outputs going into it. But it seems like there's a sort of spiral there, which I see in various areas when we're talking about ecological crisis, which is this desire, this feeling that we need to know the world in a way that would allow us to intervene successfully in that way, and then cycling between a despair at the failure to do that and a sort of desperate optimism of trying to remake the world into something like a fish farm. And I think, you know, in what we've been talking about, in the invitation that you're making in your work, I feel like there are clues for letting people know that, you know, the world might be something other than the way it appears through this lens. And therefore that the failure, that failing to make the world into something that can be known and managed in that way is not the end of the world. only at the end of a way of seeing it.
Sure. Yes. No, that's surely right. But I suppose the difficulty would be how people can actually put that into practice. That's always the difficult bit.
Yeah. It's how do we?
Have you thoughts about that?
Well, I think it starts with giving up, in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
It starts with
starts with stopping. It starts with stopping what you're doing, which is not working.
Yeah.
Yes.
And it was Gustavo Esteva, who's a Mexican activist and thinker, who really taught me this, because he described how he'd had these 3 times in his life where he had walked away from a situation without being able to explain why. And the last time was in the mid-70s when he turned down a job as a cabinet minister in Mexico. And he said, I couldn't explain to anyone why or what I was going to do, but in the way that he talked about it, because he then got involved with these grassroots networks in the pueblos and the barrios of Mexico City. And it was that until he left that position where he was standing, he couldn't see what was invisible from there. He had to actually go somewhere else without being able to give anyone a justification of this move for things to come into view, because the way that the people he was then working with were seen from above, from within the system he'd been working in,
Indeed.
missed something important about their ability to make life go on. So that's the first step of giving up, not as an end, but as a necessary. I say in the book, you know, giving up is always giving up on something, though it may feel like everything until after you've done it. So that's the sort of the first move, is to stop trying to save the world as we have known it, but also stop assuming that if you give up on that, then you know how the story ends.
Yes. Well, that in particular we don't do, as Ian Whitehead said. Prophets are, we don't know what to do with them, perhaps taking them outside and stoning them in some sort of merciful kind of way would be the best thing. But when everyone's asked to predict the future, I sort of think of Niels Bohr saying, prediction is a particularly difficult matter, especially when it concerns the future. So I don't think we ever know, and that keeping that space open about what is going to happen is very important. And the failure to do so is all part of this. We must have certainty. We must follow this path because we know what will happen. We usually, when we follow that path, something we didn't know happens, like the famous economic collapse of 2008-9, where we thought we had now mapped how these markets work so successfully that they would never crash again, and they promptly crashed. So the difficulty is taking something that works, as I mentioned earlier, on a small scale and trying to suggest that this is going to work on a larger one. For example, if you do have a complex system which can't be reduced to mechanistic chains of causation, you can nonetheless find a very small isolated part of it where it appears that that's what's happening, and you can home in on that, and you can see a little chain of causation, and you can interfere with it and produce a result. And the temptation is for science then to say, so we understand that now. But what you've understood is how that little chain of causation there worked, but you haven't understood the nature of the whole in which it inheres. And so when one's zooming out from some small-scale experiment, usually the thing is a quite different problem when you are looking at the whole in which whatever it was you modelled belonged.
So there's a distinction that I use in the book which came to me from John Michael Greer, and it's the distinction between a problem and a predicament.
Okay.
And he says, a problem has a solution. And the thought experiment he gives is, he says, so suppose that you can get in a time machine and go back to some prosperous rural village in the south of England in 1700, equipped with the knowledge of the Industrial Revolution that is coming and everything that is going to mean for the people there. And suppose that you can actually convince them of all of these things that are going to completely disrupt their ways of life, and for a small number of people going to make them amazingly rich off things that no one's dreamed of yet, and for many others mean life in factories or going off to fight foreign wars. And then they say to you, so what should we do? And there's no answer to that, because it's not a problem that can be solved. It's a predicament.
Okay.
Which doesn't mean that there aren't responses, doesn't mean that there aren't actions worth taking, and some of those will be wiser than others. But the world that's born out of that, which is the world of industrial modernity of the last couple of 100 years that we've been talking about, has been better at solving problems than any human culture that the world has ever seen. But increasingly over time, more and more of the problems it's faced with are the consequences of earlier solutions.
Exactly.
And meanwhile, it almost can't see that some things might not be problems, that there might be predicaments, and that another way of seeing and acting might be called for in the face of a predicament.
And what would that way of acting involve?
Well,
suspending the belief that you can solve this now seems to be an important part of it. So
a good example of a predicament that we almost still recognise as a predicament would be mortality. When we meet somebody, I remember meeting someone who had his membership card of the Cryogenics Institute, with the instructions on the back. If you find me dead, then put ice around my head and call this number. And I shook his hand, and it felt like the coldness was sort of creeping back into him, even while he was alive. But most of us, kind of at a gut level, see that as a category error. We see the fact that we're going to die one day as more like a predicament than a problem to be solved. And it doesn't cancel out the meaning of the fact that we're sitting here alive now. It doesn't remove there being lots of things we can do with the life that we have. But if our response to the fact that we're going to die one day is to try and throw ourselves into treating that as a problem to be solved, then that may not lead us to make the wisest use of the time that we have.
Indeed, and there's a further step we could take, which is not only not to see it as a problem, but perhaps not even to see it as a predicament, but to see it as an inalienable part of life and something that has its strength too. I mean, I was very impressed by something that Mary Midgley said when she was 92, and I think she died when she was 96, and she was extremely sharp until the moment she died. And she said, it's very easy to come to terms with death because one only has to ask the question, what would it be like if you literally could live on this earth forever? And I'm sure there may be some people somewhere who say, oh, marvellous, but most of us begin to feel a sort of queasiness and almost a sense of panic that there is no end to this. And if that is the case, that it's better that it has its finite nature, it has its finite, then it's only a question of when. And nowadays we always think a bigger portion is better, but sometimes there's something quite good about the standard portion of a human life. As I find myself 70 years and 9 at the moment, I feel quite happy with the idea. And I think I really think that the lack of our awareness of death and what it brings to the piquancy of life is a great loss. In the past, of course, people would have had a scholar such as I might have had a skull on the table that reminded me from my 20s onwards that I was going to die and that this had meaning. And once you accept this, and you don't see it as the enemy of life, but part of the nature of life, as I think the Chinese, the Far Eastern tradition, Chinese and Japanese, are much better at doing, seeing that the transiency of things is not a problem to be solved, not even a predicament, but is in fact something very beautiful and part of their meaning.
Well, it's a sentence without a full stop on the end has a problem.
Yes. I'm reminded of the story of Beethoven before he went deaf, hearing somebody in a neighbouring room playing a piece as far as the last note in the scale and not actually going there and having to go out and press the note before he could go back to bed.
The line, when Paul and I wrote the Dark Mountain Manifesto, the line that has stayed with me most deeply is right at the end when we found ourselves saying, the end of the world as we know it is not the end of the world, full stop. And together we will find the hope beyond hope, the paths that lead into the unknown world that lies ahead. And a year or two after we wrote that, I found myself sitting with the philosopher David Abraham,
Oh, yes.
talking about this. And in that conversation, a new turn on that came out, which was the end of the world as we know it is also the end of a way of knowing the world.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's what I'm inquiring into. And I feel like you're one of the people who's kind of holding that question at the moment.
Well, it's wonderful to have that expressed, because the idea of the way in which we know something affecting what it is absolutely central to my philosophy, and which is why I pay so much attention to attention and the importance of how we attend, not just whether or not we attend, which is important, but how we attend. By which, of course, I don't mean the means by which, but the way in which. And that changes the nature of the world. And I believe that actually once one starts looking at the world with a different kind of attention, it can change its nature quite quickly and quite responsibly. That has been my experience. So we don't have to, people often say, so what do we do? And in a way that's a sort of secondary left hemisphere question. Now we've got a vision of how we want to do things. What are the steps we need to take to accomplish it? And the left hemisphere servant should say, well, I will go and do this. And you say, that's a very good idea, and so forth. But really what we're talking about is inhabiting our lives, inhabiting the world, inhabiting the cosmos in a different way, which depends on the nature of the attention, which means a relationship. Because attention is never, a camera doesn't pay attention, a microphone doesn't pay attention, it receives. And we don't just receive, we pay attention, and that means that we bring something of our own to whatever it is that we encounter. But I also profoundly believe that that something else responds to our attention. I never have believed since I was, a young adolescent, that it was true that the world was a sort of heap of non-responsive material. It's always seemed to me to be vibrantly communicating with me, and that there is this exchange all the time. So out of that exchange comes what is real. Because I do believe, and I argue philosophically for those who can't see why on earth I would say that in the matter of things, that relationships are primary, that what actually exists first of all is relationship, and that the things are secondary to the relationships. So when there are relationships, bits start to stand out and we go, oh, there's something, a thing. And that's what we identify. But it's a web of relationships. When you think about how an embryo develops into the animal, it doesn't add a liver and a heart and a spleen and a whatever. These things come out of the whole. And they only are embedded in that context of the whole. And then they stand out and you go, what's that over there? We'll call that the liver. So in an organism, there are areas of relationship which become what we then call things. And this is quite coherent with something that means intuitively something to me, but is part of all the great so-called wisdom traditions of the world, that whatever we mean by God, that first grounding whatever that encompasses it all, is that its nature is love. I mean, that is a common theme of all these traditions. And love is nothing if it's not a relationship. That's exactly what it is. It doesn't exist. But, you don't have to things first. Love exists. And out of love come the beings. And I believe that the purpose of, this is getting a long way out perhaps, but I think that the purpose of the cosmos, one might say, why why, if there is this ground of being, whatever you like to call it, the Tao or God or whatever else, why did it bother to create? And I think the answer is that it itself only becomes fulfilled through this act of creation, because there is another and there is a reciprocity. So that reciprocity between the divine and ourselves is hugely important, not just for us, but also for the divine, which means that we also play a crucial role in it. We're not just passive observers, once again, like the camera or whatever. We are making ourselves, and we are forging the reality of the universe by our responsiveness. And that helps to explain why things evolve in the way that they have done. Why was the first, as we believe, inanimacy? And how did animacy come about? And why has this animacy taken the form that it has of developing creatures like ourselves, who are in many ways so much shorter lived and more vulnerable than ancient creatures way back down this phylogenetic tree? I mean, there are examples of actinobacteria in the depths of the ocean, single-celled organisms that are themselves over 100 million years old. So a 70-year life seems like, well, what's that achieved? I think the whole drive of it is towards differentiation, the unfolding, like the bud that unfurls. And it's not the negation of the bud that it turns into a flower, it's the fulfillment of the bud that it turns into the flower, and the flower eventually to the fruit. So all these things, that's an image, of course, from Hegel, but that idea that things are fulfilled through their unfolding, their individuation, without that threatening the integrity of the whole, is very important. And this process leads through life to two important things. One is our greater responsiveness, and the other is a much rapider rate of response as a whole, as a species, or even as an individual to the world. Both a more rapid ability to respond and a far more intense and wide-ranging response. So a vole may well appreciate the things in the garden that I appreciate at some level, but there are certainly things that I can see and appreciate as a human that vole can't, which is not to say that the vole doesn't have things that it appreciates that I don't, taken as granted. But what we bring to the party is our greater response, which includes things like writing the Mass in B minor. And this is an extraordinary response to the creation. People sometimes talk about it as though, well, yes, but it's so tragic. You know, we're tragically cast into this pointless, meaningless universe, and our response is to do this. But this is back to front. That thing came out of the universe by willingness to listen to it, by willingness to write what I write, Bach's willingness to write what he wrote. All these things come out of the cosmos. They can't come from anywhere else. So they're, in a sense, things that are unpacked, that are potential in it. So there is no chasm between us and this cosmos, and it only looks like it has no meaning and no awareness, because science at some stage in the last couple of 100 years decided that it would make a simple principle, that it was not going to consider anything that suggested either purpose or responsiveness, and anything that couldn't be measured and wasn't material. And so at the end of its elaborate process, it solemnly pronounces, I can't find any purpose or any evidence that consciousness can be real. I mean, there really are people, tenured professors in Western universities, who hold the belief that consciousness is an illusion. But, consciousness, for there to be an illusion, there has to be consciousness.
And it seems like the invitation that is contained in this end of the world as we know it, with all of the harm and damage that is unfolding, that is also the end of a way of knowing the world, is an invitation back into relation.
Absolutely.
Back into participating in the world as we always were anyway, rather than pretending that we're standing above it and knowing it and managing it.
Absolutely, that is so true. And really what I'm saying is that something as simple as practicing changing the way in which you attend to things changes the world and changes you, and obviously changes for the better a relationship, if you can pay appropriate kinds of attention. And of course, everything involves a different kind of attention. There's a kind of attention that is detached and is entirely appropriate, that, for example, of the surgeon who's carrying out a delicate operation and simply has to treat the body as not that person that will wake up from the operation in order to be able to do his or her job efficiently. So different kinds of attention are important, and they bring us back into connection with something surprisingly quickly. And so when people sort of despair about what is happening, those who wish to find can find quite quickly what it is that they're seeking. And it may be a problem or a predicament that many people won't survive. That is always going to be a possibility. Mm-hmm. Maybe our civilization won't survive. Maybe it will. Maybe it will in a wiser form, in a less arrogant and hubristic form, on a much more local level, and a much more coherent and interconnected way. We don't know. But this business of being taken back into relationship and this receptive, this giving and this taking, which is so fundamental, this can be achieved.
I'm thinking of an Italian philosopher, Federico Campagna, whose work I got to know while I was working on this book. And he has a lovely way of putting it. He says, sometimes you are born into the ending of a world. This is a thing that has happened before.
Exactly.
And the way that you diagnose this is that the future no longer works. Because what we ordinarily are talking about when we talk about the future is an extension of a story that we were born into.
Yes.
And if you've been born into the ending of that story, then attempts to extend it no longer convince anyone. And I think a lot of what we've been witnessing around the world in the last 10 years or so is the political manifestation of the failure of the future. And the appeal of the past is so powerful in politics today. Attempts to invoke the future don't work in the way they did in the mid-20th century, because this world is, in some sense, coming to an end. So what Campagna says is, so if it is your discernment that you have been born into the ending of the world that you were born into, what's worth doing? And he says, well, you can stop trying to make sense according to the logic of the world that is coming to an end, and start trying to create good ruins, things that may turn out to be helpful to the people beyond the end of this world, to those who have to make life work, among all of the things that will be left behind and carried forwards, but understood perhaps in very different ways after this particular story that we happened to be born somewhere late in has come to an end. And I feel like maybe that's what we're trying to do as thinkers, as writers, as artists right now in networks like Dark Mountain, is to make good ruins, things that may turn out to be fertile and full of possibility after the failure of the future that we were promised.
That's wonderful. And I suppose what it suggests is that we don't by any means give up on the future. We just give up on the future as a projection of the way we've been doing things.
Exactly.
So, and that's a hopeful idea. It's a very profoundly productive idea if it can be embraced.
Yeah.
And again, one has to accept limits, and mortality is one of them, and the civilization has a mortality as well. In fact, they tend to thrive for a few hundred years, probably 300, 400 years, and then they tend to decay wherever they have been. And so we have to accept that there is limitation, but the left hemisphere absolutely rejects any idea of boundaries, limitations, finiteness. The simplest example is that it will absolutely deny that there is anything wrong with it, although the person has a paralyzed left arm, perhaps the whole side of their body. They'll just deny that it exists rather than accept that there could be a problem or a limit. It's always going for, we can do away with the limits, the boundaries. And a lot of what is wrong with us now is we knew no limits. There were no limits to what we thought we could do, and the world would still carry on being okay. This turned out to be, predictably actually, a very stupid thing to believe. And I can't really imagine why people still carry on with a philosophy which is all about trying to dispense with what they see as the limits on being whatever we want and doing whatever we want.
So how do we help the left hemisphere at that point where it's stuck in that limitlessness? What are the moves? I mean, I think that's what you're doing as a writer.
It's as difficult as how God could have helped Satan in Paradise Lost. Lucifer, the brightest and best of his angels, became this grudging competitive force. And this is really an introspective understanding, as there is in so many mythologies, of an overseeing power that understands and a part of it that thinks it knows but doesn't, and that tries to usurp the power. So it's a very difficult thing to do. However, there are a couple of things that work in our favour. And the first is that we can see what is happening, I believe, that the left hemisphere is predominant and that this is damaging for a whole range of reasons, since it is less understanding and less intelligent, and its way of going can't be sustained. And that means that we can actively favour what the right hemisphere is. We can make a point of listening to, understanding, and directing our efforts towards receiving what is the right hemisphere can tell us and give to us. And the other is that the left hemisphere is rather like the emperor with no clothes on, that it sort of believes that it's marvellous and fine and so on, and suddenly you see how pathetic it is. And that itself is a wonderfully liberating insight, that we don't have to be tyrannized by this voice that says we're clever, we understand it all, it's all mechanical, we know it. We can just say, well, actually, that's hilarious.
It's just, there's something about laughter in the middle of all of this.
I hope so.
This takes me back to the way that I've thought about knowledge and knowing. Because the example I always use to talk about this sort of threshold between the arm's length knowledge and the experience of knowing is, I say, think about the moment when you get a joke. You don't have any information that you didn't have the moment before, but you see something differently, and it will affect you emotionally, intellectually, bodily. And that's the simplest version of the kinds of encounter, the kinds of being pulled across a threshold out of the trap that we need.
Wholly agree. And I think that humour and the great humourists are up there they're up there in my pantheon along with the great poets, because what they're doing is just that. A poet doesn't, as it were, tell you things you didn't know, but it helps you to see things that you thought you'd seen, but you didn't really appreciate, understand, or feel. And that is profoundly moving. And humour is, in another way, the achievement of this kind of an insight through what they have in common sorry to refer to the brain here, but what they have in common is that both of these things depend very largely on the right frontal cortex, which can understand implicit meaning, multiple meaning, and tone, and all these things that modify meaning, which are present in poetry and are present in humour. And, one of the things we absolutely have got to do is to liberate humour again and say, no, it's not good enough to say people can't make jokes about things. They can make jokes about anything. And if you don't like it, that's for you to sort out.
So it's as if the left hemisphere, like applying all of this back to the predicament or problem or whatever it is of the trouble that the world is in, not least in terms of climate change, the left hemisphere wants to design a way out of that, to come up with a plan that will somehow allow us to reboot the future, to have some extension of the world as we have known it. And the invitation is somehow to stumble into another way of being human together, to stumble into another chapter of the story, rather than to design and plan it out on a spreadsheet and implement it in the world.
Yes, and that stumble, of course, is the way the left hemisphere would think of it, that it's a stumble. But actually what it is quite probably a wise move that comes from our unconscious. And what you're really pointing to is that having everything consciously planned out is not the way to achieve everything in life. It's the way to achieve the solution to various incredibly circumscribed problems. It's been estimated that 99.5% at least of everything that we know, as it were, with our body, with our brain, is not in the focus of our consciousness. Mm-hmm. But because of that, it can be much, much richer. And there's an argument for saying that there's something damaging about making things explicit and focused, because you limit them to one single simple idea that has to be pursued. Whereas in the implicit understanding of a situation, one can, with enormous economy, bring together a whole lot of different elements that come out of the field of one's experience, out of being alive, and bring them to bear. And here again, I often quote this, but I think it's so marvellous. And Whitehead said two things. He said that a civilization advances according to the number of actions and thoughts that can be taken care of outside of the glare of experience. And the other was that applying thought is like a cavalry charge in battle. It's something that can only be done occasionally, is very expensive and requires fresh horses. So you can't just be doing this all the time. In fact, in a way, what one would say is that one only brings this cumbersome mechanism of focusing on it in the full glare of the spotlight and trying to solve a problem when there is a problem. But when things are running well, you shouldn't be bringing that glare to bear on it, because you will freeze it. Much as if the pianist starts to remember his fingers while playing, then he'll have to stop playing.
And if the problem is actually a state of frozenness, then you can't attack it with that kind of cavalry charge.
Yes, but also what I was thinking is that when you are focusing on it, then you are likely to either stumble or march. Whereas when you are not focused on it, it's not so much that you will stumble, but you will be guided by something that, if you trusted, not uncritically and not without a dialogue with yourself, often not a conscious one, about what you're doing, but you will be guided by something which is different from what your immediate analysis at the conscious level would suggest was the way to do it.
The stumble becomes a dance.
Becomes more of a dance, a step in a dance, or something of the kind that comes out of one naturally. And I think we all have the experience, don't we, of knowing when that happens. That I always think of it in relation to music, that if on occasion one dances well and joyously, it's because one's not trying to dance at all, but the dance is happening in you and through you. And the music too, that music plays itself through you, not you play the music.
So one more layer as we maybe draw this conversation to a close that's coming to mind for me is this thing that I've been describing as a sort of left hemisphere attempt to map and respond to the trouble that the world is in. I think that a lot of those who in good faith are kind of describing and telling us what we need to do about the situation in these terms, it seems to me that they have a map in which the thing that the left hemisphere sees, or this way of seeing and describing the world, that is kind of through calculative measurement and that kind of reason, that this addresses the deep level of reality. And then the things that we're talking about that we might associate with the right hemisphere, poetry, humour, music, they'll say, well, all of that stuff is lovely, and it's this thing that becomes possible once the people who think like us have done the hard work of making sure there is a platform underneath it.
Yes.
And it's almost as if, I've noticed this even amongst novelists, there is an attempt to resolve Snow's two cultures dilemma from the mid-20th century by staging a marriage between the two cultures in which the scientific side plays the husband and the arts or other ways of knowing play the wife. And so they're held to be kind of beautiful, entertaining, decorative. Yes. They make the world a better place. We wouldn't want the world without them, but it's a good job we have the practical, you see the stereotypes that this is based on. And it seems to me that then as things get difficult, the people who have staged that kind of way of seeing things go, well, now it's time for the hard, serious stuff, which requires us to go into the left brain mode.
And of course, what you're suggesting, and I would say, is that this is quite the opposite. It's the upside down story.
Yes.
And it reminds me of the image of somebody who, after an evening hard work in the city, goes to Covent Garden to amuse themselves watching the magic flute, and they see that real life is the hard stuff of working at Goldman Sachs, but all this stuff is in the evening from Mozart is just a decoration. But of course it's entirely the other way around. That is the only chance this person is going to have, that sort of thing, to bring them into touch with reality. And what they're doing in that office under strip lighting, he said, is a fantasy and not necessarily a harmless one. So I absolutely agree with that. And it's the story the left hemisphere tells, that it is doing the hard work, and it's the one that was sold to me as a medical student. It was almost as though the right hemisphere, we don't really know what it's there for, but perhaps it's there to prop up the left hemisphere so it doesn't fall over. But everything important was done by the left hemisphere, but this is not the case.
And your example of the magic flute, for some reason, calls to mind for me the most powerful experience of this inversion of the stories of reality, which was when my son was born. And beforehand, I was working at the Swedish National Theatre at the time, and my boss, who was about 5 years older than me and had a couple of young children, he said, "Birth is the most animal experience you'll ever be part of." And he was, of course, completely right about that. But the bit I was less prepared for was it was also the most mythic experience. That the temporality of that journey through birth and the turns within the journey was absolutely something that was familiar to me from the terrain of fairy tale and mythic story and the kinds of journey that's being staged in the magic flute. That somehow the kind of, again, the linear accountancy version of time is not the thing that's there underneath, not the thing we encounter when we're there with the blood of birth or death. That actually in those moments we're simultaneously drawn into the fact that we have always all along been animals, and that to be an animal is to live in dream time and myth time more than to live in the kinds of time that the guys under the strip lighting in the city office, or lots of the ways that we do science or talk about science imply is the true real there.
Yes, I suppose it's that these existential encounters of birth and death that we realise that time isn't I think it's very real, but it isn't. It's rather like science. Science is very real and important, but it isn't necessarily the way it's now conceived. And time is other than the way it is now conventionally conceived. And that would take us a long time. I have a chapter in The Matter of Things solely on time and the ways in which the hemispheres see it. But I really like that. And this idea of a process struck me very forcibly, because when my third child was born, my mother was dying. And my mother was at one part of the M3, and my wife was in the labour suite in Winchester, and I had to consult with the obstetrical team and take time to go up the motorway, say goodbye to my mother, and come back to see my daughter born. So you can imagine the strange experience of that, and the emotions, and the sense of being in a non-bureaucratic time.
Well, thank you, Iain. I hope that conversations like this provide sort of strange little openings or doorways through which people have a chance of stumbling into another way of seeing where we find ourselves and what's worth doing. Gliding, yes, dancing into.
Dancing into another way. Thank you very much. It's been lovely, Dougald, talking.